Hey everyone, this is Mason Hutchison and welcome back to Herb Rally, your daily herbal podcast. We come out with about 5 episodes per week, so be sure to tune in often. Our goal for the show is to help you along your herbalist journey no matter what stage you're at. We have over 565 episodes, so feel free to peruse those episodes and you're bound to find something of interest. Today's episode is brought to you by the Spice Rack Medicine course, and that's taught by Jade Alicandro Mace with Milk and Honey Herbs. And I'll just briefly go over some of what the Spice Rack Medicine course is. Oh, before that, I want to mention that registration closes on December 13th, 2022. So that's coming up. That's about a week away. So this course covers the rich subject of kitchen medicine, demystifying herbalism and bringing it back into the home. You will explore the amazing medicinal uses of the culinary herbs and ways to capture their properties for medicine, both in herbal preparations and in our food. Among the most ancient of plants included in human diets, these plants are still much loved and utilized in modern herbalism today. You will also delve deeply into the subject of food as medicine. Deep immunity, true health that comes from the core, is best built through nourishing foods and the tonic herbs. You'll learn how to eat right for your personal constitutions, understand the energetics of different foods, use the tonic herbs and medicinal mushrooms daily in the kitchen, and how to get the most nutritionally from the foods we eat. There will also be, of course, plenty of medicine making and cooking demos. So just to briefly cover some of the course features, there are 6 core modules, which contain 15 plus hours of audio and video lessons. There's a deep exploration of kitchen medicine, that's culinary herbs, adaptogens, herbal soups and broths, seaweed, medicine, remineralizing, nutritive tonics, medicinal mushrooms, and more. There's folk medicine making in the kitchen, which is bitters, cordials, herbal honeys, oxymels, herbal ghee, electuaries, infusions, and more. And this is a self-paced course with lifetime access, and modules release weekly, but you never lose access to the course should you choose to complete it at your own pace. There's also live Q&A sessions, 3 live webinars for Q&A, replays will also be available, and over 250 pages of PDF handouts and recipes. So I will include a link in the show notes because the URL is rather long, but you could also visit milkandhoneyherbs.com. As I mentioned, I'll leave the link in the show notes. That'll be the easiest to click on. And one more time, the Spice Rack Medicine Winter Online Series 2023. Registration closes December 13th, so just about 8 days away. I've worked quite a bit with Jade over the years, and I really love her teaching style. And actually, today's episode is with Jade, where she talks about herbal broth. This episode is actually a couple years old, but I wanted to do a replay just so y'all could get a feel for her teaching style. So also want to mention she did a whole module for us on the Art of Frugal Nutrition, which is our sliding scale course. Slides all the way down to free, so if you want to register for that or learn more about how to save money and how to eat nutritious food, you could go to herbrally.com/frugal nutrition to learn more about her module along with the several other modules. Also, before we get into the show, I wanted to read yet another 5-star Apple Podcast review. So this one is left by Wellness84, and if that means they were born in the year 1984, so was I. I was born in 1984. So Wellness84, they say, my go-to herbal podcast. Herb Rally has been one of my go-to podcasts for years now. It has something for beginning and advanced herbalists, and the content is always compelling and evolving. I have discovered numerous herbalists, and it has continued to increase my herbalism knowledge substantially. So thanks so much for that, Wellness84. I think it's cool that you think the content over the course of the years has evolved, which, yeah, looking back, it really has. Even just like my voice on the podcast has evolved, my comfortability in front of the camera or behind the mic, but just everyone in the community as well, all the contributions from the herbalists that I've developed these relationships with over the years. It's been really fun to see their contributions to Herb Rally overall, and yeah, I have to agree. I think Herb Rally's evolved quite a bit over this past 7 or 8 years, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So, anywho, if you would like to get a shout out on a future episode, please consider leaving us a Apple Podcast ranking review or whatever podcast player you use. I typically check Apple Podcasts, but if you do leave me a review on a different platform, just email it to me and I'll read it out on the show. Also, before we get into the show, I wanted to plug our Herb Rally Schoolhouse. This is our membership area. You could learn more at herbrally.com/schoolhouse. And basically what we do is we come out with new and exclusive content each week. Although in the month of December, we're not going to be releasing any new classes. There's currently probably 30 classes in there right now. But over the course of time, the growing library just keeps building for our Schoolhouse members. And it is only $10 a month. And it's one of the best ways you could help support our work here at Herb Rally. If you want to check it out and get your first 30 days for free, you could use coupon code podcast at checkout. And one more time, that's herbrally.com/schoolhouse. Use coupon code podcast at checkout for your first 30 days for free. So thanks so much for listening. Thanks to Jade, as always, for contributing to the Herb Rally podcast, and highly recommend checking out her Spice Rack Medicine Winter Online Series 2023 at milkandhoneyherbs.com, or click on the link in the show notes. All right, I'll talk to you sometime very soon. Bye.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking all about herb-infused bone broths. And my name is Jade Alicandro Mace. I'm an herbalist based in Western Massachusetts. I've been studying herbalism formally since around 2005 and studying plants long before that. And I've been in practice and teaching since about 2010. I'm super inspired by food as medicine, kitchen medicine, and accessible DIY herbalism, which is really what I feel like food as medicine is. And so I'm really excited to bring you this topic. And for any of you that are really interested in this topic and wanting to go really deep, registration is currently open for an online course that I teach every winter. It's called Spice Rack Medicine, and we just go really deep into all things kitchen medicine. And it will be open until January 22nd. So if any of you all are interested or really enjoy this podcast episode, you can check it out. And there'll be a link for more info on that in the show notes. For now, let's just jump into our topic. So what we're going to be talking about today is the addition of herbs into our bone broth, because many of us make bone broth. And by the way, if you're vegetarian or vegan, you can take any of this info that I'm talking about and just remove the bones. So you can still listen along, and you can definitely make this recipe vegan or vegetarian. But, bone broth is really big right now for good reason. So many folks are dealing with digestive issues, inflammation, allergies, autoimmunity, and bone broth really helps to address so many of the symptoms of those diseases and issues. So we're not actually going to go super deep into bone broth itself, because I feel like there's so many resources out there and so much has been written and said about that. But what I want to focus on is the addition of herbs into your bone broth, so that if you're already making it, you can add them in, or if you've been curious about making your own, I just want to encourage you to add some of these different herbal categories into your broths, because if you're not adding them in, you're really missing just a huge opportunity to elevate bone broth into even richer, more powerful food as medicine. So what I'm going to describe to you is a total staple in my home. I'm constantly making this and keeping it in the freezer. And as soon as we start to run low, I'm always making another batch. So I'm going to share with you the different categories that I like to put into the bone broth when I'm making it. And I'll talk about some of my favorite herbs within each of those categories. I'll talk about use for the broth itself. And then I'll also go a little bit deeper into just broadly like each category and, why you'd want that in your broth, what it does for you, and just all of that. So that's kind of where we're going to go for today. So really, the basic concept of this broth is it's sort of like a kitchen sink formula. It's what we call in herbalism, right? Where like if it's just everything goes in there. That's a little bit what this is like, but not in a bad way. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to start saving all your bones from any meat that you buy and freezing them. And this is how I make the vast majorities of my broths. It's generally chicken bones that I'm saving. And then what I do is I also buy some chicken backs, which you can get at most grocery stores, generally frozen, or you can ask. Many farm stands have them too. If they sell meat, they'll have chicken backs. And these are just wonderful. It's just like a really cartilage-rich, great part of the chicken for making really good broth. So I'll generally supplement with the bones that I freeze. And I always try to buy chicken on the bone. And then if you have wings or whatever it is, split chicken breasts, save your bones. All that cartilage and any extra meat is a good thing. So make sure you keep that and just freeze it in a Ziploc in your freezer. Same if you buy a whole chicken. And so you're going to start saving those for your broth. And then the other thing you want to start freezing is all your veggie scraps. So I particularly like to save anything in the allium family. So garlic, leeks, scallions, onions, shallots, any tips of those. If you're not using the tougher end of the leek, definitely save those greens. They're amazing for broth. So that's a great category of vegetable scraps to freeze. Any of the root veggies are really lovely, like carrots or sweet potatoes. You might want to avoid things in the brassica family, unfortunately, even though they're so good for us. But in a broth, they can make it kind of bitter. So that would include things like broccoli, cauliflower, turnips. Those can make your broth like a little bit weird. So those I generally don't save, but I'll save celery ends. I said carrots, sweet potatoes, like corn, any like just nice sweet veggie. So freeze those. And then when you've got, your freezer is overflowing, it's typically when you're going to want to make this, or if you feel a cold coming on or you're running low on your stock, that's when you want to get this ready. So what you're going to do is you're just going to take your biggest stock pot, and I pretty much fill it almost all the way to the top with a combination of the bones and the vegetables. But you're going to want to leave some room because for the herbs that we're going to add, that we're going to talk about. So this recipe is just like total kitchen medicine. I don't have an exact recipe for you because that's really not the nature of what this is, right? So I will try to, as I go along, share a little bit about proportions. Like when we get to seaweeds, you don't want to overdo it on your seaweed, for example. So I will talk about, in relation, like each of the categories in relation to each other. I'll try to share a little bit about like some basic ratios to keep in mind. But this is really like you just get to go full kitchen witch and just start throwing stuff into your cauldron, which is your stock pot. So I usually fill it, I would say, about 2/3 of the way with a combination of the bones and the vegetable scraps. And so they're frozen, but it's okay. You can just put them right into the pot, frozen. You don't need to thaw them first. And then these are the different categories of herbs that I then add. And I will go in, for right now, I'm just going to talk about the categories and some of my favorite herbs within those categories to put into the broth. And then what I'm going to do after that is I'll break down each of those categories a little bit more in terms of medicinal action. So the first category that you want to add in there are medicinal mushrooms. So some of my favorites to add to stock are shiitake, maitake, which is also called hen of the woods, chicken of the woods, oyster mushrooms, wood ear, reishi, although don't add too much reishi because that can be bitter if there's too much, lion's mane, and turkey tail. Those are probably my favorites, I would say, of those. Well, I love them all, but 2 years ago, last year was an excellent, amazing maitake year in my area. So I had so much maitake. This year, it hardly bloomed at all. But there was lots of chicken of the woods. So currently I'm doing a lot of chicken of the woods. And you can also just purchase like any of these herbs I'm talking about. Like you don't have to feel like you have to go out and forage all your own mushrooms or like grow all your own astragalus or something. There are lots of online herbal suppliers, and also always check to see if your area has a local herb shop because that's great too. And a lot of co-ops will have a little bulk herb section too. So any of these can be purchased. So I always add some medicinal mushrooms. I always add some seaweed. And the one that I use the most is what's the most abundant in my region in the Northeast, which is bladderwrack, Fucus vesicolus. So there's so much of that here. So I harvest that, but again, you could certainly purchase it. So bladderwrack is an excellent one to add. You could also do kombu, wakame, Irish moss, which will make it nice and thick if you want a thick broth, which will also happen if you have a lot of bones in there. And there, dulse, you could add dulse. That's a really lovely one. So definitely seaweeds. And then you have your nutritive herbs. So you can add some of your nutritives. There's a lot to choose from here, but some of my favorites are oat straw, nettles, alfalfa, rose hips, lamb's quarters are great, plantain leaves, plantago species, chickweed, parsley, I consider to be a nutritive, cilantro, also shan yao or Chinese yam, and or red date jujube. Those are also nutritives that are very common Chinese soup herbs. Dandelion leaf and or root, and burdock root. So those are all lovely nutritives. So you want to add some of those. And then there's the culinary herbs. So the culinary herbs, really, this is pretty broad. You could really go in whatever direction you want your broth to go, but like flavor wise, but the ones that I like to use the most are the Mediterranean culinary herbs. So the ones that go into my broths the most would be probably thyme, rosemary, and sage. But you could also use basil. You could also use oregano. You can also, use garlic and ginger here in this department. Black pepper. Calendula is a beautiful one. One of calendula's original old names is pot marigold because it went into the pot. So those are some ideas of some culinary herbs to add. And then the last category that you want to add are the adaptogens. So for these, my personal favorites that I add are astragalus and Cotinopsis. If I have Cotinopsis, definitely always astragalus. A few others that are really famous in the Chinese tradition of herbal soups are goji berries and hei shao wu, which we call fo tea here in American herbalism. So in terms of like some basic ratios to add these in, let's say if you were making a formula, you might want to have your medicinal mushrooms be about 2 parts. Your nutritives could be 2 parts. Your adaptogens could be 2 parts. And then you want to have a little bit more of the culinary herbs, about 1 part of the culinary herbs, because those can have some pretty strong flavors and you don't want it to overpower. And then about 1/4 to 1/2 a part of the seaweeds. So the reason that you want to have a little bit less of the seaweeds is because seaweeds in too high of dosaging can be too much because they're so mineral rich that you can actually overdo it. And they can also easily overpower the flavor of your broth too. So that's just, those parts are just to kind of give you like a basic idea, but these are all, this is food as medicine. These are food grade herbs that can, can just be eaten, many of them. And so I'm not giving in these parts so that you're like then kind of trying to measure it. It's kind of giving it to you, just give you like the big picture. And I would say that when I'm making these, no 2 recipes are ever the same. That's what's enjoyable for me about it. I like that aspect. But feel free to jot down, especially if you're just getting started. A kitchen journal is like a beautiful, beautiful thing. And you could just jot down maybe the first time you make it. And you could just, even if it's just like real basic ideas, like, it was about 1 part of goji berries and about 1/2 a part oat straw, you can start keeping track. And then you can keep track of your results and be like, whoa, I didn't really love it with alfalfa, but I loved the nettles, etc. Because everyone's going to have their own tastes. And so I tend to put these on at the top after I've added all the frozen vegetables and the bones. And so I'm kind of just visually eyeballing the amounts here, making sure that I have a good amount of everything. And these don't have to be dried herbs. It could be fresh. If you have them fresh in your garden, that's great. And so for the mushrooms, mine tend to be frozen because that's what I'll often do just to quickly preserve. If I have a big harvest of a mushroom, I'll just often freeze them just as is. You don't have to blanch or anything if you're just going to go right into the broth. But it could also be dried mushrooms, which are easily available online and at herbal suppliers. And then you're going to Cover it all with water, and you're going to add a hearty amount of apple cider vinegar. I generally add about a quarter cup, and this could also be fire cider. So it could be any oxymel. The honey taste, it's just so dilute that it won't like make your broth taste like vinegar or honey if you're adding an oxymel. Or you could add any of your herbal infused vinegars, which I'll often do just for an extra little mineral boost. Or it can just be straight apple cider vinegar. And what this does is it helps acidify it and helps to draw the minerals out of the bones. So that's an important part. And then you're just going to cover it all with the water. Don't go too high up to the top because as it starts to cook, it'll start spluttering everywhere and overflowing. So just give it a good couple inches of headspace at least. Put a lid on it and turn it up high. And you're going to wait a while because remember, everything in there, most of it is frozen. So it's going to take a while. And once it comes to a boil, I like to keep the lid on. But at that point, I will turn it down and put it on my smallest burner, turn it down on low. And the idea here is you just want a nice low simmer, enough so that it's actually cooking, but not so high that all your water boils off. And if that does happen and, you go and, I don't know, you're doing something else, you come back and you're like, oh my gosh, all my water cooked off. It's not a big deal. You can add more water as needed. And you're going to want this to cook for at least 24 hours, but even up to 20 or 48 hours is great. And it doesn't mean you have to be home for that whole 24 hours. You can definitely turn it off, leave, do your thing, come home, turn it back on again. Where I live in the Northeast, I tend to make this mostly in the cooler winter months. And where I live in the Northeast, I can just leave it on the stove. The house gets pretty much cold enough during the day or at night that spoilage isn't really an issue. But if you lived in, a southern climate or something like that, you could just put it in your fridge while you're gone, take it back out, and you could, do this over the course of 2 or 3 or even 4 days. That's totally fine. Another thing I'll do occasionally, if I feel like I'm going to be gone for long enough that I don't feel comfortable with it on the stove, is if it's cold enough outside, I'll often just stick my pot outside, like on my front porch or something, then bring it back in when I'm home, keep it cooking. So it's up to you if you'll feel comfortable with it cooking overnight. So you can make that choice yourself. But you want it to cook for at least that 24 and even better up to 48 hours. And then you're going to strain it. And I let it cool and then I do freeze it in plastic yogurt containers. My preference is to use glass almost all the time, but I've just had way too many mason jars break on me in the fridge or the freezer, even if I leave headspace, all the things. So that's what I use. And a little note is because this is such like total kitchen medicine, and I was saying like every time you make this broth, it's going to be a little bit different based on what veggie scraps you had, what herbs you added. And so I encourage you, once it's done, to taste it. Because you may find that occasionally your broth is like really, really potent and you're like, whoa, that's really intense. And you may need to dilute it when you're using it and with water. So here's some of the ways that you would use it and that I use broths. So they can obviously just be used in any place you're going to use broth already. So soups, stews, casseroles, like all your kind of like hearty winter month foods, dals, like if you're cooking some red lentils or something, that can be the water base. You could even use it as the base for khichdi or congee. That's really, really lovely. Congee is a rice porridge. If you look up congee, you'll find so many different recipes. But congee with this kind of broth is amazing and very, very medicinal. And then probably our favorite way to use it here in my home is whenever we're cooking a grain, like rice, we always cook it in the broth. And like I said, you can always just taste each batch and see. Occasionally, I'll dilute it like half broth, half water for the rice, but it just varies batch to batch. And I would say that this is probably the number one way that I get herbs into my family. I have 2 kids. They like rice, and when I'm giving them rice that's cooked in broth, it feels so wonderful to know that they're being so nourished. And I have to say that when I started making my bone broth in this way, probably really in earnest, I would say, like got really serious about like I only make bone broth in this way, especially with the addition of the mushrooms. Um, I saw a big change in my kids' immune health. So it's always really wonderful as a parent and as an herbalist just to see like these firsthand results of the herbs. And it was really like night and day, like going from feeling like, your kids are sick all the time, which if you have young kids, that's a part of them building a healthy immune system, right? So you're just like, okay, here we go, winter. But it was a pretty profound difference. And what I also saw was that, of course, we still got sick, but often when there was like this really virulent thing going around the community or whatever, and people would be taken down for like days, and then knowing that we had caught the same thing, but seeing it go through our house, with way diminished symptoms, just getting over it much quicker. And so that's what you'll often see when you start adding all these different herbs to your broth, is just this great immune support. And we'll talk about that more when we get into the different categories of the herbs in terms of like what they do. So that's really wonderful. And I think another reason that I'm just such a fan of food as medicine is that, again, as a parent, even for yourself, it's really hard to remember to give your kids herbs every day. Like, that's the truth, right? It's also really hard to give yourself herbs every day. And so when we add these herbs into our foods, like, we have to eat. I have to make my kids dinner every day. It really just becomes more built into your life. And that to me is like what makes food as medicine so accessible. Is it's just sort of like, instead of another to-do list thing, it's built right into your life. And when it's right there in your food, it's just such a beautiful way to weave the herbs into your life that doesn't necessarily always add like more to your plate, more to your to-do list. I mean, it does add more to your plate, right? More medicine, but I mean like more to your to-do list. So it's just, that's one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of this recipe and wanted to share it with you. And one other way that I just didn't mention, but that's a very straightforward way of taking broth, is you can just warm it up and add a little miso or a little bit of sea salt and just sip it by the mug. And that's really, really lovely, especially if you're sick or just getting over something and you don't necessarily want like a big meal. And then I also love like bone broth ramen. I just love having like good quality ramen noodles with just the bone broth as this bone broth, herb-infused bone broth as the base. And that's a super lovely way to get it in. So these are really wonderful for anyone who's deficient, anyone who's debilitated, anyone who has poor digestion, anyone who's, nutrient deficient. Bringing the broth in is great. And I would say that in my practice, I do often suggest this kind of a recipe for folks. And sometimes, depending, it might be the only thing I recommend in terms of herbs. It might be like, oh, okay, well, here's how we're going to get the herbs into you, especially if they're already somewhat into cooking, and especially if they're already making bone broth, which a lot of people are. It's a really nice, beautiful way to just get the herbs in. Right? Because as much as possible, we want to weave the herbs into folks' already existing routines as much as we can, as opposed to giving, one more thing, which sometimes that's just the way it goes. But if there's already this existing ritual that we can fit the herbs into, that's really always going to be super effective in terms of compliance and all of that. So let's talk a little bit about these different categories and why we would add these different categories of herbs. So the first one to start with, I would say, are the adaptogens. And remember, some of my favorite adaptogens to add are astragalus and codonopsis. And these are herbs that quite broadly increase our resilience to stress. So we could go on forever about each of these topics, but suffice to say, we are living in a time of practically unprecedented stress on our bodies and nervous systems as human beings on this planet. And the adaptogens, they're kind of truly an herb for our time. There are some adaptogens that could be so stimulating that they could be easily abused, like say something like ginseng to kind of help you burn the candle on both ends even more. But that's not what would happen here with something like astragalus or codonopsis. These are deeply nourishing herbs. that help support our adrenals. And when you take adaptogen herbs over time, especially, what you start to see is a falling away of a lot of your day-to-day stress. If that sounds like awesome and magical, it's because it is. And of course, who doesn't want that? But there is a very profound thing that can happen over time when you take these adaptogen herbs where you realize, you kind of wake up one day and you're like, wow, okay, my to-do list hasn't changed. Nothing external has really changed. Yet I'm handling all of this stress with so much ease, so much resilience. And that is really where they come in. So an adaptogen gets its name from being an herb that helps us adapt to stress. And in order to be classified as an adaptogen, herbs that are adaptogens need to show a harmonizing effect on the nervous system, the endocrine system, and our immune system. So, and when I mean harmonizing, it means bringing it back into balance. So in terms of the immune system, an overactive immune system, something like autoimmunity or something, or allergies, that the adaptogens can help to lower that overactive immune response. And then if you have very poor immunity, low immunity, the adaptogens can help to increase your immune system's activity. And astragalus is an especially wonderful one for that. And both astragalus and cotinopsis are traditional herbs from Chinese medicine that are traditional soup herbs. So cotinopsis, you could actually just put right into soups and you can eat it. It's very sweet. Astragalus is actually prepared and sold in these big slices, specifically because it's traditionally added to soups, but it's too tough and woody to eat. So it's in those big slices, so you can easily just remove it from your soup. So, those are ones that even if you didn't get it together to make the big herbal bone broth that we're talking about here, you could even just throw some of that into your soups, or really, especially the astragalus when you're making rice or anything like that, just add in some astragalus and it'll just cook right into the broth of your rice, and then you can just, or the water, and you can just take it right out before you eat it. So that's where the adaptogens come in. They're very safe for long-term use. They have very few, if any, side effects, and they also tend to be somewhat sweet in flavor. So they are nice for the broths. Both astragalus and cotinopsis have a nice sweet flavor to them, and they're both somewhat moistening, so that's really nice. So that's where the adaptogens come in. They're lovely, and I definitely encourage you to get to know them if you don't know this class of herbs. And next are the medicinal mushrooms. So they are getting so much play right now for, the benefit of all of humanity. They're wonderful, wonderful herbs. And gosh, they are also immune modulating. So just like the adaptogens, so they bring your immune system back into balance. And they also are very detoxifying, right? So I like to think about sort of microcosm, macrocosm, right? Like our bodies, our physiology, the way we express disease, we are a little microcosm of the macrocosm of planet Earth. And we think about what the mushrooms do, which is they literally feed off of detritus, dead organisms. And that's kind of what they do in our body as well. So they've been studied for their effect as potent antioxidants. They've been studied on their effect as being anti-cancer. They've been studied for their effect for some of them increasing mental functioning, cognition. In Chinese medicine, many of these herbs are the mushrooms, especially, I meant to say there, are used as spleen qi tonics, which means they enhance digestion. So they're really a panacea in a lot of ways. And I encourage you that even if you don't like the taste, like a lot of people, they don't like the taste of mushrooms, or even more often, they don't like the consistency. Like a lot of folks are like, oh, they're just like too rubbery, or, something like that. Like they just don't love the texture. So then put them into your broths, right? You don't have to eat them, but they do have to be cooked and especially boiled. So that is really a benefit of putting your mushrooms into broths like this, because especially some of the really tough polypore mushrooms like reishi, turkey tail, artist's conch. I don't think I mentioned that one before, but that could also go into a soup like this. They really need the active constituent for the immune system in there is a polysaccharide, which is water soluble. So they really need to go into a water-based extract, which is what a broth is. So they just make so much sense in a broth. And then the other nice thing is that some of these mushrooms, especially for sure, I know shiitake and maitake, they contain glutamates. So they contain the umami flavor. And the umami flavor is a flavor that increases the savoriness of our foods. MSG is synthetic glutamate. And of course, MSG makes you want to eat more of that thing. So that's obviously MSG is not healthy at all. But the natural glutamates found in maitake, shiitake, they're also in a lot of fermented things like soy sauce and miso. They actually make your broth like delicious and they make you want to eat more of it, which is good. So they increase that savory factor. So that's another nice reason to add the mushrooms in. And again, a great way to get mushrooms into kids who don't always like the texture, but they don't always mind the flavor when it's in a broth like that. Oh, and as a little side note, one of the things that I save and freeze for stocks like this is if I'm cooking, say, for example, like shiitake, and I'm cutting off the tough stems, I will save those for broth. So you can always do that. Or if you've harvested some wild mushroom, like a wild maitake, and some of it is a little too tough because it got a little old or whatever, you can always freeze that for broths. So that isn't an issue when it comes to broth. So definitely add your mushrooms in there. And then you've got your nutritive herbs. So the nutritive herbs, that category where I listed off, there's a ton of different ones you can put in there. I always try to put some of these in my broths. I love parsley. That's probably my favorite soup nutritive herb. And I try to add like a nice bunch of it when I can. I also will freeze the stems of fresh parsley when I buy it in the store and I'm just using it in my cooking. I use some of the stems, but at the very bottom where they get really big and tough, but I will never compost those. I always save those to freeze and to add into this whole crazy mixture as well. And another one that I really like to add is lamb's quarters. And I also really love adding nettles as the nutritive here. And you can even make a lamb's quarters verderette, which is essentially, it's like mincing up fresh lamb's quarters and then you preserve it with salt. And you can find recipes for this online. It's like the original veggie bouillon. And that can be added to your stock. And that's a cool way to get some salt flavor in there, as well as some of the lamb's quarters. So that's really nice. And the reason we add the nutritives is because they're nutrient rich. They tend to be especially mineral rich. And of course, adding all of the vegetables is obviously wonderful too. They're adding so many lovely minerals and vitamins to this broth. But, the nutritive herbs, they're classified as such because they're especially nutrient rich. And we are well aware at this point that sadly our soils are, really depleted from a lot of essential minerals that our body needs, especially magnesium. So if we can get that in any way, shape, or form, it's always a win. And a lot of these nutritive herbs are also double as wild greens, right? So they are just literally food as medicine. So things some of the nutritives that you can just eat that could go into these are like the nettles, the chickweed, plantain. I didn't mention violet leaf, but violet leaf could certainly be a nutritive in here. Chickweed, so lamb's quarters. So any of these, any of those like wild greens that you can eat that you enjoy, those could be added to your herbal bone broth, and it can be fresh or dried. So, and then there's the culinary herbs. So the culinary herbs are amazing. We spend a lot of time talking about them in my course, but suffice to say, why are we adding the culinary herbs? Well, of all these categories we talked about so far, none of them are particularly essential oil rich. but the culinary herbs are very rich in essential oils. And that's part of why we're not going to go so crazy with them as opposed to like the adaptogens, the mushrooms, the nutritives. I was like, do a good 2 parts each of those. You would want to do less, like maybe about 1 part of your culinary herbs just in relation to the others, because they tend to be in flavor pungent and bitter. And, we love bitter. Herbalists, we love the bitter flavor, but you don't always want your soup broth to be overly bitter, right? Or your rice that you cooked in this broth overly bitter. So they could easily overpower. But what the culinary herbs do is they add digestive support and even more immune support. Because these essential oils, of course, they tend to be very antimicrobial. And a really cool fact about herbal bone broth when you make it this way is it has a super long shelf life in the fridge. Not that I'm like trying to test the limits here, but I've certainly found jars that I was surprised were still good in my fridge. And I believe this has to do with all the antioxidants that are in here from the different various herbs and also all the essential oil content from the culinary herbs that gets added. And these are all just like natural preservatives. And so essential oils, they tend to be very broadly antimicrobial, so they're great for fighting off pathogens. And then, of course, our culinary herbs also tend to be carminatives. And carminative, that's the herbal action for herbs that support digestion and also ease gas and bloating by tending to move gas. So they're digestive support. So who doesn't need that in their food, right? And they also add a nice flavor. So like I mentioned, the ones that I love the most that probably find their way are sage, thyme, and rosemary. And then, of course, garlic. And I do sometimes do ginger as well. And then I love adding calendula, which is quite bitter and pungent. So too much can be too much, but it's really beautiful in the winter to add like a handful of your dried calendula flowers into the stock pot. It's just like, they're just like liquid sunshine. So they just add this beautiful, uplifting kind of like antidepressant effect just looking at them. But, what I do is I will harvest and dry these herbs. And these are ones that, it can be pretty easy to make your own supply of these for the winter if you have, a small little herb garden or even some herbs and container plants. So I'll just, harvest them in the summer when their essential oil content is the highest and dry them in little bundles. And then I'll often just store them either as is or in jars. Occasionally, I'll just store them quite simply just in the bundles in Ziploc bags in my spice cabinet, and then I'll just pull them out and use them as needed. But I'll often add like to each, I have a pretty big stock pot. So I'll often add to like each batch about like one good handful of the culinary herbs, like a nice little dried bunch. And it just, like I said, it just depends. But those are my top 3 favorite personally for my stock. So the rosemary, thyme, and sage. So you always add your culinary herbs. And then the seaweed, right? So seaweed, like I mentioned earlier, is one that you don't want to overdo because it's so mineral rich that, certain minerals in excess can be harmful. But that is really, the seaweeds come in a few different ways. So again, they're like the most nutritious things on the planet. They're so, so mineral rich. But they also are very rich in these really cool complex polysaccharides, which are super detoxifying to the body and also are very much aid digestion and assimilation. So the seaweeds, alginate is one of those polysaccharides. And the name of the other one is leaving me right now, but they've also been studied and have been shown to be strongly anti-cancer. And, the other thing that we want to think about is that every coastal peoples who had access to seaweed, all these traditional cultures and traditional food ways are always incorporating seaweed into their diet. It's a known, really important source of nutrients and minerals. So the seaweed is just, it's a beautiful, beautiful addition. And the seaweeds also contain naturally those glutamates. So the seaweeds also increase the savory factor. So that's why like miso soup is so delicious. It's just like an amazing, like just umami bomb, right? It just is so savory. And So the seaweeds will also contribute and add that to your broths as well. So I wanted to try to keep this in a nice little amount of time, a nice little like nugget for you to kind of be inspired by and jump off of. So I'm going to start closing, but please know that we could go, this is purely, I guess, really kind of just meant to be broad sweeping for you to get an idea of, if you're already making broths, ways that you could add some herbs. And if you're not, just, try not to get overwhelmed. Just even if you just started by adding like one of these herbs from one of these categories, if you were just like, wow, I really love the idea of adding some mushrooms, or I really just want to add some sage to my broth. That's wonderful. That's great. That's an awesome start. So in the online course that the registration's currently open for Spice Rack Medicine, we do go, there's practically like a whole module on each of these. There is actually on each of these different categories that we talked about, the adaptogens and the mushrooms. And, we do the materia medica of over 20 different culinary herbs. And we talk about seaweeds as well. So it's really just more in depth. So if that's something that you're interested in. But my hope was also that this gave you enough information to be inspired and to be able to spring off and start making your own herbal infused bone broths. So links for my website. So my business is Milk and Honey Herbs. So it's milkandhoneyherbs.com. So links for that will be in the show notes. Links for the course. I also run a Patreon where I offer monthly classes. So there'll be links on that. And I share a bunch of free information and recipes on my social media outlets, which are I'm on Instagram and Facebook, both at Milk and Honey Herbs. And I have a blog where I have a lot of recipes and information as well. So I'm hoping you all enjoyed this and got some ideas and inspiration, and hope you all get out there and have some fun in your kitchens. Take care.
And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Herb Rally podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us here at Herb Rally, we now have a text message community, believe it or not. Basically, it's just updates from us. We send about 1 to 7 texts per week, notifying you about new events, videos, courses, podcasts. You get the idea. It's pretty much like our email newsletter, just in text form. So if you'd like to receive text messages from Herb Rally, just text JOIN, that's JOIN, to the number 541-256-2895. Again, that's JOIN to number 541-256-2895. And to stop receiving texts, that's easy too. Just text STOP to the same number. It'll opt you out immediately. Okay, thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.